Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to start the build of the Tamiya Arocs 8x4 tipper. First up in the manual is the info on the radio gear and tools. To make it go you need at least a 2-channel radio, but to use all the functions you're going to need something a bit more beefy along with some electronics for the truck. We're going to start simple and add functions bit by bit. For tools you need the usual set, screwdrivers, cutters, pliers, all your basic tools. Just keep in mind the screw heads are JIS rather than Phillips, so if you can, make sure you're using the right ones. Then we have the nice little cartoons down the side, and finally step 1 of the manual. Now each section is broke up into parts bags, starting with bag A. So the first thing we do is tip out the contents. Then empty the sub-bags into some pudding pots so we can find what we need as we go. Right, step 1 is setting up the radio, but we're going to skip that as I'm pretty sure our setup's going to work just fine. If you've got all new bits, it might be an idea to rig it up for a test though. In step 2, Tamiya want us to build up the servo savers for the steering and the shift servo. Well, first, we're not going to be using the servo savers, and second, we're using an alternative mount for the shift servo, so there's not much for us to do in step 2 either. Step 3 involves the steering servo mount, which we can do, so let's get started. We're going to go into a bit of detail in this step for new builders, but the rest of this video and the next is going to be a quick blitz to get the basic chassis together. With the Tamiya kits, the diagram calls for some plastic parts, D7 and D8. That simply means we need to find the D parts tree and cut parts 7 and 8 free. For this one it's easy to identify which is which, but sometimes parts can look almost identical, so try and keep track of which is which. Next, down the left hand side, Tamiya lists the small metal parts. For this it's 4 3x8 self-tappers, 5 washerhead 3x8 self-tappers, which are for the shift servo, so we don't need them, and 4 3mm washers. Then all we do is assemble the bits as it says in the diagram. Now sometimes Tamiya have a build order, or they have notes and tips. In this step, Tamiya tells us not to tighten the MA13, the 3x8 self-tapping screws. That's so when we mount the servo to the chassis, the mounts can settle into their position. Then we can nip them up. It's important to read all the text and understand the diagrams before you get stuck in. Generally they're nice and clear, but every so often you'll have to have a bit of a think to see how it all goes together. Right, from here on we're covering bits of the build that we've done many times on the channel before. The suspension, axles and gearbox are all the same as all the other Tamiya trucks, so we're going to run through them nice and quickly. Okay, step 4, front suspension mounts. Now this is the standard setup. The only odd bit is Tamiya have a single tank mounting bracket, F10. I'm guessing it's not for a fuel tank. It's going to be interesting to see what goes there. Otherwise it's all very familiar. Step 5 is pretty much all the same, except it's for the second front axle. This time there aren't any damper mounts, and there's an extra bit of plastic that I think is for the manual override switch on the Tamiya tipper actuator kit. In step 5 we build up the crossmember that sits between the rear axles. Now normally I drill a hole through it to run the wiring for the rear lights, but this truck has an upper subframe, so there's going to be loads of places to run the wires. Also in this step, Tamiya wants us to glue the little rubber bump stops to the plastic mounts. I find it easier to add some glue just as I'm installing them, so I'll do that in the next step, although if you're really careful they do stay put just fine without any glue at all. Step 6, cross members. Now these all go together without any fuss. I would suggest keeping the screws just a little loose until the front member goes in the next step though, so the chassis can still move a little bit to line up all the holes. For the bump stops I'm going to use a tiny amount of Yoo-hoo, a rubbery glue, just to make completely sure they're not going to go anywhere. You really don't need a lot. Step 7 has us fit the front crossmember, and in a normal build we'd also fit the shift servo, which we of course are going to be skipping. So all we do is fit the front crossmember, then go around and nip up all the screws so we have a nice rigid chassis. For step 8, we'll build up the steering cranks as per the manual, except we're going to replace the bushings with a set of bearings. I'd also like to replace the cranks with an aluminium set, except as far as I can find, only the standard crank is available. The rear one is slightly different with a shorter lower arm. There is a little bit of vertical play in the shafts, so I'm going to add some shims to take it up. With the steering, taking out any play we can find makes a huge difference to the final handling. Now I'm not going to fit the Tamiya ball ends as I'm planning to use RC four-wheel drive rod ends instead. Well, that was the plan, but more on that in a moment. In step 9, we simply attach the cranks and the servo to the chassis. All very straightforward, we just need to remember to tighten up the servo screws that we left loose. Step 10, making up the steering linkages. Now we're going to be flipping the front axle around to correct the steering Ackerman, so we'll need a different linkage to clear the gearbox. We could of course make one, but I'm lazy, so I've got a Carson one. It's essentially the same as the stock linkage, except it drops down in the middle to clear the bottom of the gearbox. For the rod ends, the plan is to use RC four-wheel drive ones. These ones are from my parts box, so I already had them in stock. What I didn't notice is these are for M4 rods, which of course is too big for the M3 linkages. For now, I'll just build up with the Tamiya ends and I'll swap them out later. Step 11 just involves clipping the linkages that connect the servo to the front crank and the front crank to the rear crank. For now, so we can use the Tamiya ends, I've fitted the Tamiya balls. Again, these will get swapped out later. Also, we need an arm for the servo, but we're going to sort that out in a bit when we know what the clearances look like. Step 12, the fuel tank, which should be a really simple fit. It just covers the steering servo and gets screwed on. Except our super torquey servo is a bit of an odd shape, so it doesn't fit. But that's nothing a hacksaw can't fix. There we go, much better. Almost a flush fit. I'll be painting the tank and other bits as they come up off camera, as we need to, but for the dry fit it looks pretty good. Next there's the two side stays that just get bolted to the chassis, then we need an arm. We'll end up using the aluminium one, but for now, until we're 100% sure how much space we have, we'll just use a chunky plastic one. Now we can clip on the linkage and see how the servo runs. Well, it certainly sounds smooth. The cranks move quite nicely too. Very good. Right, bag B. This one has the front axles and all the mounting hardware. And instead of using the stock axles, we've got some aftermarket ones. They're a bit less sloppy than the stock ones, plus they have aluminium knuckles, so we can drill some holes in them for the steering mods without weakening them too much. They come with some nice looking steering rods, but they're a bit thick, especially for the front axle, plus they do have some very sloppy metal rod ends. So we're going to remove them so we can use the stock ones. Okay, step 13, mounting the leaf packs to the axles. Now there's lots of parts here, but it really is just 4 sets of the same assembly, plus the 2 dampers. My only tip is not to tighten the nuts that clamp the leaf packs until they're mounted to the chassis. The leaf packs can then self-align before you tighten them so they don't bind up the shackles. Step 14, mounting the axles. As I just mentioned, leave the nuts loose until the axles are hung, then tighten them up. Otherwise, it's all pretty simple. Step 15 and 16 involve mounting the knuckles and the other bits, but with these axles they're already fitted. Although we will need to flip the ones over on the rear axle so they face the right way. It's just a case of removing the nuts and the pin, swapping them round and reassembling. Just so we can connect everything up, I'm going to install the Tamiya ball ends on the axles and clip on the linkages, the frontmost one being a Carson rod. This leaves us with an almost working setup, except the short linkage that goes between the crank and the knuckle on the front axle hasn't got anywhere to go. Now usually you just drill a hole and mount the ball end, but because it's not in line with the hinge point, we would end up with more steering one way than the other. On a single steer truck that isn't so bad, as we can just fiddle around with the endpoints on the radio, but here it's mechanically tied to the second axle, so the ball end needs to be in the right place for it all to work properly. The current plan is to make a little aluminium plate that'll extend the arm sideways so it's all square, but it needs a little bit more thought before I start drilling holes. Either way, that's bag A and B finished. Just a quick overview of course, but you can see it's pretty much all the same as the other Tamiya trucks, except for the twin steer. Next time will be the rear axles and the gearbox. Again, more standard Tamiya stuff. Then we'll be on to bag E, where we start getting into the fun bits, the bits that really make this truck unique. For now then, that's going to be it. So as always, thanks for watching, like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!